Welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Laveria, and today we're going to go over the greatest psyop ever, the greatest psyop of all time. And I'll tell you what I mean. If you are like anybody and you watch TV or you talk to people about UFOs and you watch the news and UFOs are brought up, you always have this giggle factor, right? People always, when you bring up UFOs, they giggle. They say, they say, "Beam me up, Scotty," or they say, "I love Star Wars, but I don't know." And anytime anyone talks about UFOs, especially before 2017, it's always been something kind of that made people suspicious about you, right? If you talk about UFOs, people would look at you weird. I know because I used to do that about other people, right? It wasn't until 2020 that I came around to the reality of the UFO phenomenon. But, even today, with all the disclosure that's happened, with all the different congressional hearings, you still have this giggle factor. People still feel uncomfortable to talk about it, and even when people have experiences, they don't share them with anybody unless you really gain their confidence, right? And I've noticed that. Like I've actually talked to a pilot, an Air Force pilot who like was passing through my church once here in Japan. Or different people at work who saw UFOs, you know, and they didn't tell me until they saw that one. I knew a lot about the subject, right? And I showed them like my PDF files, my stash on Google Drive, and once they saw like I was knowledgeable about the subject, then they shared those stories with me. Why? Because there's a giggle factor. And where does that giggle factor come from? It comes from the CIA. It comes from Generoso Pope Jr. I'm going to show you how that came to be. Now, let's get started. Okay, if you don't know UFOs are real, just get educated, okay? Watch Age of Disclosure. All these, congressmen are on it, all these senators and congressmen, right? You have Carson, Rubio, who's now Secretary of State, Rounds, Gillibrand. Okay, UFOs are real. They're a technology. They're piloted by something that's not human, okay? And yes, there's the meteors and the swamp gas and the mylar balloons that are misidentified all the time. We know that. But then there's other stuff that just is still remains unidentified. And based on how they behave, we know they're piloted and it's not ours. Okay. So, groundwork. Some of the more kind of, I don't know, poignant parts of this presentation, parts that require extra documentation. Um, these are my sources, right? Deeds of My Father by David Pope, about his grandfather, Generoso Pope Sr., and his father, Generoso Pope Jr., um, who are these huge, publishing magnates in New York. And also this book about Generoso Pope Jr. Uh, so these are my two main sources. These are two really good books. And it's interesting because this one by Vitek is more has a more academic tone, and this one is a guy like talking about his grandfather and his father, right? So even though they say the same things, they talk about them in different ways and with come at it through different angles. Okay. So here's the second preliminary thing we have to go over: cognitive conditioning. Okay, this is just the most basic psychology, right? What is cognitive conditioning? Okay, so take the example of this little dog, right? If you put food in front of a dog, his mouth is going to water, right? If you ring a bell in front of the dog, their mouth isn't going to water, right? But if you ring a bell every time you feed a dog, every time you feed a dog, you ring a little bell, you ring a little bell, you ring a little bell. Every time they're eating, you ring that little bell. Um, Eventually, all you have to do is ring that little bell and they'll salivate, right? That's a conditioned response. You have cognitively conditioned them to associate the bell with food and the pleasure of food, and their body just naturally, from through a subconscious process, just causes that reaction accordingly, right? And this is the kind of thing that has created the UFO giggle factor. This is the exact same process that causes otherwise intelligent people to shut off completely, to laugh, and to make jokes about tinfoil hats. Okay, now how did this happen? I'll tell you. Let's start with Generoso Pope Sr. Generoso Pope Sr. had an Italian newspaper in the United States. Okay, so these are Italian immigrants, right? He had an Italian newspaper in the United States. Think of it like Telemundo from 100 years ago. Okay, so he had a Italian newspaper in the United States called Il Progresso Italo-Americano, right? And you'd think, hey, it's just an Italian newspaper, no big deal, right? But really, this man was a supporter of Benito Mussolini, as many Italian Americans were at that time. And he knew Mussolini, and he received medals from Mussolini, and he met him personally in Rome. How do we know this? Well, read the books. You can pause and read this if you want, or you can pause and read this if you want. But yes, General Pope Sr. was both a supporter of Mussolini and supported by Mussolini. Why? Because Il Progreso ran positive stories about Mussolini. And so Mussolini made sure that any kind of news that was happening in Rome vis-a-vis his government, especially things he wanted people to know, got to Il Progreso before it got to any other Italian American newspapers, right? So Il Progreso would always have the scoop on Mussolini news, right? Stuff from Rome as it was happening before everybody else, in exchange, of course, for good press, right? So essentially, Generoso Pope Sr. was an intelligence asset for Mussolini's government, right? That's what it is. You don't believe me? Read the books, okay? Now, that's what Il Progreso was an asset for Italian intelligence, right? They wanted Italian Americans to be pro Mussolini, and so this man did that job for them, right? So look, fast forward, the war is over, right? Um, some at some point, Pope turns against Mussolini on paper, right? Because we finally got into war with Germany, by extension, Italy and Japan as well. And fast forward to 1947 when Generoso Pope Sr. and his son, Generoso Pope Jr., have a meeting with President Truman. That's right. The purpose of that meeting? To do in Italy what he had done in America. In other words, they wanted to make sure Italy did not end up communist. So there was a deal made so that somehow Il Progreso would, just have anti-communist propaganda, right? And what's interesting about this is it reminds me of Operation Paperclip, right? Just as we had former Nazi scientists, former SS scientists, okay, secreted away to the US, to build NASA and our aerospace industry. And by the way, the Russians were doing that too. We also had a former, Mussolini fascist asset in the United States, General Pope Sr., who was now working for us, right? And he was an American. And if you're related to him or descended from him, I'm not casting dispersion. I'm just trying to tell history, okay? But now he was working for us. And now he had a mission to make sure that in the upcoming, Italian elections of 1948, the government would not fall to communists. And so Generoso Pope Jr., who is the main star of this story, in this episode, okay, went to the White House fresh out of college with his father to meet with President Truman. Okay. And this is where we get into the greatest psyop that has ever been done. Okay. So Generoso Pope Jr. graduates from MIT and becomes the editor of Il Progreso from 1947 to 1951. And he wasn't just the boss's son, because originally the original editor of Il Progreso was his older brother. His older brother liked golfing and lunch more than he did actually running the paper. So his dad fired him and put in Gene Pope Jr. Um, now, uh, this is you got to think about this. This guy is fresh out of college, MIT, and he's meeting with the president of the United States. Okay. He's meeting with the president of the United States, fresh out of college with his father, who at one time was running ops for Mussolini in the United States, PSYOPs, right, through his Italian American newspaper Il Progresso. And now he was going to do the reverse, but now in Italy, right, to make sure that the 1948 Italian election didn't, wasn't won by communists, right? That's interesting, right? Fresh out of college with your father, and then you take over Il Progreso that same year, right? So he took over Il Progreso the same year. He and his father met with President Truman in the White House regarding their, you know, psychological operations work in Italy, okay? Because his father had done this before, okay? Now, you dig a little deeper, right? There was a book in 1958 published called A Psychological Warfare Casebook, and it mentions Generoso Pope. He is quoted in this book. Okay. Now, what's interesting is it doesn't say senior or junior, but Generoso Pope Sr. had died in 1950. This was published in 1958. So it's most likely that the Pope being quoted here is Pope Jr. Okay, unless the author was sitting, had interviewed Pope Senior before he died in like 1947, held on to the quote, right, for the book he would write 13 years later, right? So one of the Generoso popes, Senior or Junior, is quoted in this book 8 years after Senior had passed away about their role um, in getting the word out in Italy to make sure the communists lost in the 48 election. Okay, and if you want something more clear, you could just Google it. And here's the little quote in the book, you know, uh, talking about what I'm talking about. Okay, so we know for a fact that Pope Jr. Okay, uh, with his father, okay, was working at the behest of President Truman, okay, to run psyops on Italians so that they don't vote for communists in the 1948 elections. Okay. Okay. Again, you could just read this again, like I told you to. Now, fast forward. The same year, Pope takes over Il Progreso. We have the Roswell crash. Now, the Roswell crash happened in the summer of 47. Pope was meeting President Truman, fresh out of college, okay, in what is it here? It happened actually in the fall. Let me make sure I got that right. Ah, dang it. November. There you go. November. Okay. So Roswell happened in the summer of 47, and then Pope with his father is meeting President Truman in November 47. So this is after Roswell, right? Very interesting. Now, fast forward 1951. Gene Pope Jr., Generoso Pope Jr., the young guy that had the privilege of meeting President Truman fresh out of college, okay, starts working for the CIA in psychological warfare. And he does so for less than a year. Less than a year, okay? And if you want a source on that, check out the book and check out this book too, okay? They give different explanations why, okay? But, in this book, they accuse him of trying to dodge the draft, right? In this book, um, something similar. But, uh, in this book, they accuse him of um, using mob connections to get in, right? And in this book, they accuse him of trying to dodge the draft. It's not an accusation, it's from his own son, right? But what I find interesting is that he was only there for less than a year. That sounds like training. Because the next year, what do you have? You have Project Blue Book starts. And what is Project Blue Book? It was like Arrow, right? We're going to get to the bottom of the UFO phenomenon. We're going to solve it for you, right? And they did some good research, right? but the conclusion was always predetermined that like there's UFOs, there's nothing to worry about, and they're not real. They're not piloted. They're not non-human technology. Okay, that was always what Blue Book was intended to be, was a debunking effort. Okay, but look at this. Blue Book starts in March of 52. In April of 52, Gene Pope Jr. buys the National Enquirer. In April of 52, they have their first issue under his watch. Okay? So that's a very tight timeline, right? Okay. He goes into the CIA for less than a year. Okay. And he gets out. And literally a month after Blue Book starts, which is the government debunking effort, right? The public facing UFO research by the government, which was again intended just to get everyone's mind off of it. A month after that, he buys a National Enquirer. Now, why is that important? Go back to our psychology little lesson. Okay. If you want to think, if you want people to think that the UFO subject is low IQ and low class and silly and, you know, just something really dumb, lazy, people who are not intellectual are interested in, what do? You associate it with something dumb, low class, low brow, um, and something stupid, intellectually lazy people would be into, right? Like celebrities, right? This is what the Inquirer does, right? You have these these tabloids, these sleazy tabloids that, expose everyone's secrets and, tell stories, half of them are not true, and you match it up with the UFO phenomenon, right? That's what the Inquirer does. Sleazy, stupid, low IQ, tabloid gossip. Half of it isn't even true, right? And paired up with the UFO phenomenon, something that's very real. Okay. So that's not by accident, folks. This man worked in the CIA, was trained. He was there for less than a year, working in psychological warfare. His father and him before together ran a psyop on the Italian people, right? To make sure their 48 elections didn't fall to the communists, right? His father had run psyops on behalf of Mussolini in the United States, okay, trying to get Italian Americans to support the leader back home, right? Until he got the news stories before everyone else in exchange for good news, right? And it just so happens that after Roswell, right, after Blue Book starts, you have the National Enquirer, which does this to the UFO topic. Okay. But that's not enough because secrets are hard to keep. And the secret of crash retrievals started to leak in 1978, right? Stanton Friedman and Leonard Stringfield, who are two kind of the legend ufologists, started interviewing Jesse Marcel Sr. And Jesse Marcel Sr. was one of the airmen who was firsthand witness of one of the Roswell debris fields, right? Okay. And he started telling his story that, yes, they told us to lie to the public. They told us to lie and say it was a weather balloon. They made me pose with pieces of a weather balloon and it was put all over the paper. Um, and, it's not true. And he talks about having handled the material and how strange it was and how it was a flying saucer essentially that crashed at Roswell. And he knew it and he was told to lie about it because it was his job. Okay. Remember our psychology class right here. So Jesse Marcel Sr., right? He comes out in a documentary called UFOs Are Real, okay, in 1979, right? And that came out in November of 79. November of 79, that's important. Why? Because a month before that, Generoso Pope Jr. starts the Weekly World News, right? So in October of 79, Pope starts the Weekly World News. A month later, that documentary comes out, right? So obviously, it didn't take a month to make the documentary, right? And get it out into theaters across the country, right? Remember, Marcel was already talking to ufologists a year before that, right? So Marcel starts talking, right? And then, you know, a year after he starts talking to these ufologists, you have the Weekly World News, right? And a month after that, the documentary comes out. And a month after that, Bob Pratt interviews Jesse Marcel. Okay. And just a couple of months after that, that Pratt interview is published by the National Enquirer. Okay. And the Enquirer, the issue that had the interview actually mentioned the UFOs Are Real documentary and said everyone should see it. Right. But let's look at what the Weekly World News is, right? For those who are maybe younger and don't remember. Okay. This is the Weekly World News. Okay. Remember our psychology class at the beginning. This is the Weekly World News. This is the Weekly World News. Okay. As opposed to the National Enquirer, with that has news stories that are sleazy and trashy and based on, real reports, whether or not the stories are true or not exactly about these celebrities and all that, coupled with real UFO stories. Weekly World News takes it to the next level and just like completely fabricated and like completely silly, right? Like nobody read the Weekly World News and thought what was on it was real because it was intended to be a joke, right? And I remember as a kid, I was like 10 years old, I even bought an issue, because if you remember the 80s and 90s, okay, I was born 1980, these things were at the checkout stand, okay? They were at the checkout stand. The National Enquirer and the Weekly World News. So even if you never bought an issue, you saw these stories, these front pages that coupled the UFO with the most stupid low IQ gossip, right? And you also had the Weekly World News that coupled the UFO with just like over the top comedy, right? Satire. Okay. And again, you go back to our psychology class, right? If you want to make the UFO topic stupid and silly and something that elicit laughs, you do it in a way that's stupid and silly and elicit laughs, right? I mean, these are hilarious, right? And like I said, I remember I bought one when I was 10, but you didn't have to buy one. And most people never did. I mean, if you grew up in the 80s and 90s, think of a time you saw the Weekly World News on someone's coffee table, right? I can't think of a time, right? And I mean, it's ridiculous, but that's the whole point. That's the whole point. They poisoned the well, right? So you have this serious UFO documentary coming out, kind of the OG age of disclosure, so to speak. But it doesn't matter. They had the Weekly World News ready to match everything that came out of after that. Oh yes, and then in 1980, Bill Moore and Charles Berlitz, their big book, Roswell Incident comes out, right? Which is like a, the first big kind of like scholarly treatment on the Roswell um, story, okay, about it being a crash of a UFO and there were bodies and it was secreted away to write pat and everything. But so what? So what? Okay. So what? Right? The vast majority of people don't even know this book exists. If you're grew up in the 80s and 90s, you probably never read this book, but everyone saw the weekly world news at the checkout stand, right? And the Inquirer, okay? And that's how the cognitive conditioning takes place. And that's why everyone, not everyone, but often when you watch the news or just in polite conversation, if you say, "Hey, what do you think about UFOs?" People will giggle, right? And if you talk about UFOs, people will kind of give you that look because they're brainwashed. They are brainwashed, as I once was, right? I used to think this topic was ridiculous. Okay. But then again, just to end, right? People always ask, how do you keep this secret so long? If UFOs really did crash and the government really did have, these artifacts made by non-humans, which are, more advanced than us, how can you keep this a secret? Well, you don't. I mean, as much as the legacy program has tried, this secret has leaked multiple times. I mean, it leaks like once a decade, more or less, right? But it doesn't matter how it didn't matter how long, how often it leaked and for how long, because the giggle factor was there, right? It doesn't matter if you were growing up in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, right? It didn't matter what Bob Lazar said. It didn't matter what Forso said or Marcel said or what Stephen Greer was saying, right? Because most people had this, right? Like just by standing at the checkout stand. And nobody wants to look like a fool. Okay. No one wants to look gullible, lowbrow, low IQ, you know, um, intellectually lazy, stupid, gullible, right? Nobody wants to be seen that way, right? No one wants to be subconsciously associated with this, right? And so that's how you keep the secret. That's how you keep the secret. And I must add, remember, Weekly World News. Okay, the Weekly World News and the National Enquirer, okay, were created by a CIA alumni, okay, who, with his father, had experience at running psyops, okay, in America for Italy and in Italy for America, okay. He was trained in psychological warfare. I mean, this is documented, okay, as documented as can be because the CIA never reveals who was or was not in the CIA. So we can only just go by, family and scholarship and that sort of thing, right? We don't have primary sources with regards to who was in the CIA, right? But I mean, come on, guys. It's obvious what's been happening. Okay. This story tells itself. Um, and again, the timing is just too tight. The timing is too tight, right? Look at this. National Enquirer, Blue Book, right? Um, the Roswell documentary, the first one, the Roswell story breaking, and the Weekly World News. It's too tight, okay? And you know, the the linchpin of it all is the fact that Gene Pope Jr. really was a G-man. He really was an expert in psychological warfare. And just as his father had used his newspaper on the behalf of Mussolini to psy up Americans, Gene Pope Jr. used his newspapers on behalf of the CIA to psych up Americans vis-a-vis the UFO phenomenon. Okay? That's the story. And that's why I think this is the greatest psyop ever. So with that, I'd just like to end with my exhortation to remember that your consciousness is not classified. Good night.